The House of the Wolfings. Chapter 1. The Dwellings of Mid-Mark. The tale tells that in times long past there was a dwelling of men beside a great wood. Before it lay a plain, not very great, but which was, as it were, an isle in the sea of woodland, since even when you stood on the flat ground, you could see trees everywhere in the offing, though as for hills, you could scarce say that there were any, only swellings up of the earth here and there, like the upheavings of the water that one sees at whiles going on amidst the eddies of a swift but deep stream. On either side, to right and left the tree-girdle reached out toward the blue distance, thick, close, and unsundered, save where it and the plain which it begirdled was cleft amidmost by a river about as wide as the Thames at sheen when the flood-tide is at its highest, but so swift and full of eddies, that it gave token of mountains not so far distant, though they were hidden. On each side, moreover, of the stream of this river was a wide space of stones, great and little, and in most places above this stony waste were banks of a few feet high, showing where the yearly winter flood was most commonly stayed. You must know that this great clearing in the woodland was not a matter of haphazard, though the river had driven a road whereby men might fare on each side of its hurrying stream. It was men who had made that isle in the woodland. For many generations the folk that now dwelt there had learned the craft of iron founding, so that they had no lack of wares of iron and steel, whether they were tools of handicraft or weapons for hunting and for war. It was the men of the folk, who coming adown by the riverside had made that clearing. The tale tells not whence they came, but belike from the dales of the distant mountains, and from dales and mountains and plains further aloof and yet further. Anyhow they came adown the river, on its waters on rafts, by its shores in wains or bestriding their horses or their kine, or afoot, till they had a mind to abide. And there as it fell they stayed their travel, and spread from each side of the river, and fought with the wood and its wild things, that they might make to themselves a dwelling place on the face of the earth. So they cut down the trees, and burned their stumps that the grass might grow sweet for their kine and sheep and horses, and they diked the river where need was all through the plain, and far up into the wildwood to bridle the winter floods. And they made them boats to ferry them over, and to float downstream and track upstream. They fished the river's eddies also with net and with line, and drew drift from out of it of far-traveled wood and other matters, and the gravel of its shallows. They washed for gold, and it became their friend, and they loved it, and gave it a name, and called it the dusky, and the glassy, and the Mirkwood water. For the names of it changed with the generations of man. There then in the clearing of the wood that for many years grew greater yearly they drave their beasts to pasture in the new-made meadows, where year by year the grass grew sweeter as the sun shone on it and the standing waters went from it. And now in the year whereof the tale telleth it was a fair and smiling plain, and no folk might have a better meadow. But long before that had they learned the craft of tillage and taken heed to the acres and begun to grow wheat and rye thereon round about their roofs. The spade came into their hands, and they bethought them of the plowshare, and the tillage spread and grew, and there was no lack of bread. In such wise that folk had made an island amidst of the Mirkwood, and established a home there, and upheld it with manifold toil too long to tell of. And from the beginning this clearing in the wood they called the Midmark. For you shall know that men might journey up and down the Mirkwood water, and half a day's ride up or down they would come on another clearing or island in the woods, and these were the Upper Mark and the Nether Mark. And all these three were inhabited by men of one folk and one kindred, which was called the Markmen, though of many branches was that stem of folk, who bore diverse signs in battle and at the council, whereby they might be known. Now in the Midmark itself were many houses of men. For by that word had they called for generations those who dwelt together under one token of kinship. The river ran from south to north, and both on the east side and on the west were their houses of the folk, and their habitations were shouldered up nigh unto the wood, so that ever betwixt them and the river was there a space of tillage and pasture. Tells the tale of one such house, whose habitations were on the west side of the water, on a gentle slope of land, so that no flood higher than common might reach them. It was straight down to the river mostly that the land fell off, and on its downward-reaching slopes was the tillage, the acres, as the men of that time always called tilled land, and beyond that was the meadow going fair and smooth, though with here and there a rising in it, down to the lips of the stony waste of the winter river. Now the name of this house was the Wolfings, and they bore a wolf on their banners, and their warriors were marked on the breast with the image of the wolf, that they might be known for what they were if they fell in battle and were stripped. The house, that is to say the roof, of the Wolfings of the Midmark stood on the topmost of the slope aforesaid with its back to the wildwood and its face to the acres and the water. But you must know that in those days the men of one branch of kindred dwelt under one roof together, and had therein their place and dignity. Nor were there many degrees amongst them as hath befallen afterwards, but all they of one blood were brethren and of equal dignity. Howbeit they had servants or thralls, men taken in battle, men of alien blood, though true it is that from time to time were some of such men taken into the house, and hailed as brethren of the blood. Also, to make an end at once of these matters of kinship and affinity, the men of one house might not wed the women of their own house. To the Wolfing men all Wolfing women were as sisters. They must needs wed with the Hardings or the Elkerings or the Barings, or other such houses of the mark as were not so close akin to the blood of the wolf. And this was a law that none dreamed of breaking. Thus then dwelt this folk, and such was their custom. As to the roof of the Wolfings, it was a great hall and goodly, after the fashion of their folk and their day. Not built of stone and lime, but framed of the goodliest trees of the wild wood squared with the adze, and betwixt the framing filled with clay wattled with reeds. Long was that house, and at one end anigh the gable was the man's door, not so high that a man might stand on the threshold and his helm-crest clear the lintel. For such was the custom, that a tall man must bow himself as he came into the hall, which custom maybe was a memory of the days of onslaught when the foemen were mostly wont to beset the hall, whereas in the days whereof the tale tells they drew out into the fields and fought unfenced, unless at whiles when the odds were over great, and then they drew their wains about them and were fenced by the Wainburg. At least it was from no niggardry that the door was made thus low, as might be seen by the fair and manifold carving of knots and dragons that was wrought above the lintel of the door for some 3 foot space. But a like door was there anigh the other gable end, whereby the women entered, and it was called the woman's door. Near to the house on all sides except toward the wood were there many bowers and cots round about the penfolds and the byres, and these were booths for the stowage of wares, and for crafts and smithying that were unhandy to do in the house, and withal they were the dwelling places of the thralls. And the lads and young men often abode there many days and were cherished there of the thralls that loved them, since at whiles they shunned the great roof that they might be the freer to come and go at their pleasure, and deal as they would. Thus was there a clustering on the slopes and bents betwixt the acres of the Wolfings and the wild wood wherein dwelt the wolves. As to the house within, 2 rows of pillars went down at endlong, fashioned of the mightiest trees that might be found, and each one fairly wrought with base and chapiter, and wreaths and knots, and fighting men and dragons, so that it was like a church of later days that has a nave and aisles. Windows there were above the aisles, and a passage underneath the said windows in their roofs. In the aisles were the sleeping places of the folk, and down the nave under the crown of the roof were 3 hearths for the fires, and above each hearth a luffer or smoke-bearer to draw the smoke up when the fires were lighted. Forsooth, on a bright winter afternoon it was strange to see the 3 columns of smoke going wavering up to the dimness of the mighty roof, and one may be smitten athwart by the sunbeams. As for the timber of the roof itself and its framing, so exceeding great and high it was, that the tale tells how that none might see the fashion of it from the hall floor unless he were to raise aloft a blazing faggot on a long pole, since no lack of timber was there among the men of the mark. At the end of the hall anigh the man's door was the dais, and a table thereon set thwartwise of the hall, and in front of the dais was the noblest and greatest of the hearths. But of the others one was in the very midmost, and another in the woman's chamber, and round about the dais along the gable wall, and hung from pillar to pillar were woven cloths pictured with images of ancient tales and the deeds of the Wolfings, and the deeds of the gods from whence they came. And this was the fairest place of all the house and the best beloved of the folk, and especially of the older and the mightier men. And there were tales told and songs sung, especially if they were new, and thereto also were messengers brought if any tidings were abroad. There also would the elders talk together about matters concerning the house or the mid-mark or the whole folk of the markmen. Yet you must not think that their solemn councils were held there, the folkmotes whereat it must be determined what to do and what to forbear doing. For according as such councils, which they called things, were of the house or of the mid-mark or of the whole folk, where they held each at the do-thing steads in the wood aloof from either acre or meadow, as was the custom of our forefathers for long after, and at such things would all the men of the house or the mid-mark or the folk be, present man by man. And in each of these steads was there a doom-ring wherein doom was given by the neighbors chosen, whom now we call the jury, in matters between man and man, and no such doom of neighbors was given, and no such voice of the folk proclaimed in any house or under any roof, nor even as aforesaid on the tilled acres or the depastured meadows. This was the custom of our forefathers, in memory belike, of the days when as yet there was neither house nor tillage, nor flocks and herds, but the earth's face only and what freely grew thereon. But over the dais there hung by chains and pulleys fastened to a tie-beam of the roof high aloft a wondrous lamp fashioned of glass. Yet of no such glass as the folk made then and there, but of a fair and clear green like an emerald, and all done with figures and knots in gold, and strange beasts, and a warrior slaying a dragon, and the sun rising on the earth. Nor did any tale tell whence this lamp came, but it was held as an ancient and holy thing by all the mark men. And the kindred of the wolf had it in charge to keep a light burning in it night and day forever, and they appointed a maiden of their own kindred to that office, which damsel must needs be unwed, since no wedded woman dwelling under that roof could be a wolfing woman, but would needs be of the houses wherein the wolfings wedded. This lamp which burned ever was called the hall sun, and the woman who had charge of it, and who was the fairest that might be found was called after it the hall sun also. At the other end of the hall was the woman's chamber, and therein were the looms and other gear for the carding and spinning of wool and the weaving of cloth. Such was the roof under which dwelt the kindred of the Wolfings, and the other kindreds of the Midmark had roofs like to it, and of these the chiefest were the Elkerings, the Vallings, the Alftings, the Beamings, the Galtings, and the Bearings, who bore on their banners the elk, the falcon, the swan, the tree, the boar, and the bear. But other lesser and newer kindreds there were than these. As for the Hardings above named, they were a kindred of the Upper Mark.